მომხსენებელი იქნება ბატონი სტივენ დრეი, ის გახლავთ ინგლისელი თეოლოგი, ჰერმენევტიკის და გამოყენებითი თეოლოგიის, ეკლესიის ისტორიის დოქტორი, ევროპის ევანგელურ თეოლოგთა თანამეგობრობის სათათბიროს წევრი, დაინტერესებულია მართლმადიდებლობით, რაც გამოიხატება კავკასიაში მის ხშირ ვიზიტებში. თემა, რომლითაც ბატონი დრეი წარდგება ჩვენ წინაშე, გახლავთ განქორწინება და ხელმეორედ ქორწინება, ქრისტიანული ეკლესიის სამი ტრადიციის გადასახედიდან. გთხოვთ.
Good afternoon to you all, and it's a privilege to be back here in Tbilisi and taking part in this third forum. My subject today is divorce and remarriage, a creative engagement with the three great traditions of the Christian Church. And to begin by making the observation that the three great traditions of the Christian Church, that's the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant, have adopted very different positions when it relates to matters of divorce and remarriage. In summary, they are as follows. The Orthodox churches, as I understand them, have usually allowed for divorce and remarriage, and sometimes allowed more than one divorce and remarriage to the individuals concerned. The Catholic Church is almost entirely in opposition or contrast to that. The Catholic Church affirms the indissoluble sacramental bond of marriage, which can only be ended by the marriage being annulled on the basis that the ceremony was faulty or the understanding of the participants as to what was taking place was defective or for some similar grounds. Protestant churches have traditionally adopted, especially certain evangelical churches and communions, a position somewhat between those two. It's generally affirmed on the basis of Matthew chapter 19 and the parallel passages in which Jesus is asked questions about divorce and marriage, that divorce is possible only on the grounds of adultery. To this, however, normally there is an addition made, and that is what's known as the Pauline exception. And that's based on 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And the exception argues that divorce can also take place following the desertion of one of the partners by the other. Protestant evangelicals are, however, divided as to the question of what happens next. Whether following a divorce, remarriage can take place, and the dividing line usually is between those who affirm that remarriage can take place, or those that say that remarriage can only take place following the death of the previous partner. And if you were to read the standard works on divorce and remarriage by evangelical scholars, you would find them, generally speaking, holding one of those two views. Now, this short paper I'm giving to you wants to suggest that different conclusions can be reached from reading the three passages that are usually at the center of discussion relating to divorce and remarriage. Those passages are, first of all, Deuteronomy 24 and verses 1 to 4, of the passages in Matthew and the parallels in the other Gospels that I've already referred to and also the passage in 1 Corinthians 7. Now, some of the methodological issues that are going to be implied in my presentation in the next few minutes, I will be dealing with more fully tomorrow. So I may, when we come to discussing it later, say, well, you must come back tomorrow to hear what I've got to say then. But I hope that this talk at least is self-contained. Now, looking at the text in Deuteronomy 24, 1-4, there are three critical questions that as evangelicals we need to ask relating to this particular passage. The first is to observe that this is what we might call a casuistical text. Now, for the benefit of those of you who've never heard that word before, which probably is most of you, casuistry, a casuistical text is where an example is given, usually preceded by the word if, and it anticipates that there might be other scenarios, but so that the example given is not itself exclusive. So Deuteronomy 24 provides us with one possible context in which divorce may take place. It does not imply that there are not others that might exist. Secondly, the particular law you find in Deuteronomy 24 appears to refer what we might call as Hollywood marriages. The serial marriages that some of the top actors and actresses seem to be engaged in, sometimes even remarrying someone they've previously divorced. In other words, what Deuteronomy 24 is referring to is how issues of serial divorce are to be dealt with. And in this context, it refers to the uncleanness that is sometimes advanced as the ground for a divorce taking place. Now, in evangelical circles, the word uncleanness, or whatever is the equivalent word in Georgian, or Armenian, or Ukrainian, it is often assumed to be a reference to adultery or some other form of sexual failure. However, the Hebrew word is not as specific as this in its general semantic range. It might, I suggest, therefore, be better rendered any alleged ground for breakdown. In this context, then, the law places limitations on the abuse of such claims as might precipitate what in the West we would call quickie divorces. Thirdly, the law also reveals a pastoral dimension within a context where marriage was viewed for life. In other words, whatever the ideal, it recognizes that marriages do break down for all sorts of reasons, and the outcome of such breakdowns require sensitive pastoral handling. If you look carefully at Deuteronomy 24, what is very obvious is the concern for the woman. Comes out very strongly in this particular law. Now to Matthew chapter 19 and verses 1-12. In these passages, Jesus' opponents were out to trap him by inviting him to take sides in an ongoing contemporary debate between the theological liberals and the theological conservatives of the day. Jesus carefully avoids taking sides by reminding both of them that they need to foreground in their thinking the original intention of marriage as ordained by God. Very simply then, Jesus says, God's intention for marriage is that it is for life. Of course, the disciples then ask a question, and it's prompted by that passage in Deuteronomy 24. Now, arguably, Jesus' response that was given by Moses because of the hardness of their hearts is Jesus comparing his rule with the Mosaic rule. That Moses' law is now superseded by the law of the kingdom. And that's how it's usually understood within evangelical circles. However, this is not the only way to understand Jesus' words. He could be drawing their attention to the fact that marital breakdown and divorce can never be freed from the taint of human failure and sin, a reality that exists to the present. It wasn't simply a problem in Moses' time. It's a problem in modern England and in contemporary Caucasus. And only therefore where the fundamental basis of the union has been broken by the conduct of one party can the other person be freed from guilt. In other words, Jesus reaffirms the fundamental nature of marriage and the failure to honour God that is involved in every marriage breakdown, while at the same time recognising the need for pastoral accommodation in the face of human failure. Now, if that is what Jesus is saying, he's not contrasting what he's saying with Moses, but he's actually agreeing with Moses, which my understanding of the Bible suggests might just be right, but that's another point. Now to 1 Corinthians 7, verses 12 to 16. If Moses and Jesus recognized that divorce and remarriage was possible, and in Moses' case offered a potential scenario upon which to reflect, Paul is not offering an exception, but another possible situation. Just as Moses was referring to quickie divorces, Paul is referring to the situation where a partner gets married, gets converted, and the other partner no longer wishes to live with them. So this is the situation of the desertion of the unbelieving spouse by an unbelieving spouse of a believing partner. And Paul's response is again pastoral. The believer is not to falsely or guiltily hold on to a marriage bond that is gone. He or she is free. Now, if this reconstruction is correct, and doubtless at some point during the next day or two, some of you will want to come and challenge me on it, and I acknowledge that it's not entirely free of exegetical problems. If it is correct, however, there are certain things that we can learn from this. First of all, that as evangelicals we do need what I describe as a high view of marriage. Marriage is not simply a legal contract that can be broken at will under certain legal conditions, but it's a covenant that is enacted before God, whether or not it takes place within a church. And it's a covenant that is entered into with the expectation that it is a lifelong commitment. And that's the backstory to Moses' teaching. It remains the unchanged backstory to what Jesus and Paul say too. Now this is countercultural, as it was in Jesus' time too. But nevertheless, it appears to be the consistent teaching of both the Old and the New Testaments, and of a range of witnesses in the Old and the New Testaments, which includes Jesus himself. Marriage is a relationship entered into as a covenant before God and is for life. Secondly, we do need to respond to marriage breakdown with great pastoral sensitivity. Both Moses and Jesus and Paul recognize that marriages do collapse. And a breakdown is frequently painful for at least one of the parties, and of course any children from the relationship, as well as others such as parents and friends who are caught up in it. People caught up in a marriage breakdown, especially if they're not the main party, in leading to such a breakdown, do not need to be struck by a rod. They will probably feel guilty anyway, but they need compassionate support and guidance. God hates divorce, but he permits it in cases of pastoral need, and those of us who are called to pastoral care need to follow that perspective. Then there is the question of the grounds for divorce, and I'm suggesting to you that the grounds for divorce are actually numerous. Despite much discussion in evangelical circles, the fact is that marriages break down for all sorts of reasons, including the one that Paul mentions, including the one that Moses mentioned, and for other reasons as well. And you and I you don't need me to spell out the reality of that marriages break down. And that's the reality that Moses acknowledged openly, and Jesus and Paul accepted implicitly. And I think we need to be sensitive to their guidance. Then I would make the point that remarriage is possible, but not always advisable. I haven't actually spelt out this particular point in my earlier discussion, but I make it here. It's obvious that the reason a first relationship collapse may remain present when the second marriage is contracted. That's part of the reason for for Hollywood marriages. Egotists marrying one another and remain egotists are going to have just the same problem in a second marriage as they did in the first. So temperamental and other weaknesses can create situations where unresolved they may well lead to repeated failure. However, a first failure may and often does have the opposite effect. Addressing past failure, the second marriage is entered into with a resolve not to allow past failings to mar the new relationship. And many second marriages, in my experience, are highly successful precisely because those issues have been addressed. Now, this paper positions itself somewhat towards the orthodox end, I suppose, of the spectrum that has been adopted by the Christian churches. But it's motivated by theological and pastoral factors rather than viewing the biblical texts as providing simply laws. It seeks to affirm the high calling of marriage, if not in strictly sacramental terms, very nearly so, I suspect, while recognizing sin both destroys human relationships and that God mercifully condescends to our failures and offers us a fresh way forward through repentance, and thank God for that. It is in fact where the above view that I've expressed unites itself to the revealed character of God found on every page of Scripture, the God who is compassionate and merciful. It is that encourages me to believe that I might just have got the Scripture's perspective correct. There I am, slightly inside 20 minutes. So thank you for listening.